Hi there. All right, so last time we talked about characteristics of Renaissance music generally, and I was reading from pages 81, 82, and 83 in the Canian Ninth Brief Edition. And now we're going to look at sacred music in the Renaissance. Next lecture will be secular music in the Renaissance, and it's really a shame that I only have one lecture basically to talk about each of them, because the music deserves to have more time spent on it than that, but that's all the time we have. So today, among other things, we're going to learn about maybe the two greatest composers that you never heard of before, and those are Josquin de Pré, the greatest composer of the early Renaissance, and Giovanni Pierluigi da Palestrina, as we call him, the greatest composer of the late Renaissance. And what's interesting, one of the interesting things about these two, and unfortunately, again, out of the hundreds of thousands of composers of sacred music, and actually both of them composed secular as well as sacred music, but we're only going to deal with these two in this lecture on sacred music of the Renaissance. The book only mentions these two specifically. There are many, many others, and many great composers. It just so happens that Josquin is kind of considered the greatest of the early Renaissance, Palestrina the greatest of the late Renaissance, and interestingly, their careers overlap to pretty much perfectly encompass the Renaissance. So remember, the Renaissance in music, the dates that we are using are 1450 to 1600. Turns out that Josquin was born, we think, we're not sure, but right around 1450, and lived until 1521. We know he died in 1521 because he was pretty famous by then. Palestrina was born just 4 years later in 1525 and lived all the way to 1594, which is basically at the end of the Renaissance. So their lives, although they don't overlap, there's 4 years gap between the death of Josquin and the birth of Palestrina, but their lifespans pretty much encompass the Renaissance, 1450 to 1600. And so they sort of bookend that period of time, their careers. Josquin, I'll start with him because chronologically that makes more sense. Josquin, as they mentioned here, was born in the Netherlands, in modern-day Belgium, but what was then referred to as Flanders. Remember I said last time, this region in Europe, let's say north of France, along the coast, where modern-day Holland and Belgium, and a little bit inland to Luxembourg, and maybe also northern France. This region, which was at that time kind of generally referred to as Flanders, where the Flemish composers came from. This region produced most of the great composers of the Renaissance, including Josquin. So he's from what is today Belgium, but he worked in Italy. So remember that the Renaissance really begins in Italy, and from there kind of spreads out into the rest of Europe. And also that in these days, let's say, like the increasingly powerful and wealthy noble class, from the church is kind of in decline, still powerful, still very important, but the nobility are on the rise, and they're becoming more powerful, more wealthy, and they are the patrons, the great patrons of the arts. They are the people who are hiring painters and sculptors and musicians and so forth, and they are competing. They're like trying to outbid each other for the best talent, and this definitely happened in the case of Josquin. If I remember, I'll relate this little episode from his life. This is a time when, if you were any kind of a creative person, an artist, a musician, whatever, Italy would be the place that you would want to go if you had your choice. That's kind of where the avant-garde, where the cutting edge of the Renaissance really is. And so this is where Josquin, being the greatest of his time, spent most of his career. Although he did also work for the King of France, King Louis XII. He worked for, well, actually he got his start as I believe that the first that we hear of him in the historical record or whatever is as a singer in the choir of the Sistine Chapel. This is the Pope's own chapel there in the Vatican, right next to St. Peter's, where they have the famous ceilings, of course, painted by Michelangelo. And interestingly, about 25 years ago, they restored the Sistine Chapel, and you can see that they freshened up. They cleaned all the centuries worth of gook and grime and candle soot, from candle smoke, off of the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, and they renovated the whole chapel, including the choir loft. Now, the choir loft is this area above the chapel where the choir would sing. And Josquin was a chorister, was a singer in that choir loft. And there was a tradition in the Sistine Chapel choir that every new chorister, every new singer, would carve their name into the wood paneling of the choir loft. And then when they restored the Sistine Chapel and cleared off, all these old layers of varnish and whatever, they actually found the place where Josquin had signed his name. And it's, I believe, the only existing signature of Josquin to this day. We don't have his signature on any pieces of paper, but we have it there in the paneling of the choir loft of the Sistine Chapel. And for Josquin to have gotten that job in the first place, he must have been one of the best singers in Europe. Because the Sistine Choir Chapel at that time was probably only about 24 people. And they would have picked the very best singers that they could find. So he was certainly a great singer, and then later became known as a great composer, working for various dukes in Italy, including the Duke of, I believe, certainly of Ferrara, Mantua. These are different city-states. Later worked for King Louis XII of France, and he was basically the most famous, illustrious, eminent composer of his day. Now, this is a time when composers or musicians are not nearly as famous, or like big, celebrities as they are now, right? To be a celebrity in the Renaissance, as any kind of an artist, it was difficult. Of course, Michelangelo was kind of a celebrity in his day. This is when artists are really pushing to be kind of recognized personally. Because to be really famous or illustrious during those days, you had to be a great warrior, basically, a warrior king, to have won great battles or been a great ruler. That's the only famous people really were, the nobility. But despite that, Josquin was really one of these guys who was really in demand, who different royal patrons were trying to outbid each other in order to hire. So there's this famous story, for example, of the Duke of Ferrara we have the letters, apparently, between the secretary of the Duke of Ferrara and the Duke himself. And they're talking about who they should hire as a new court composer. They put out this sort of job advertisement, and who are they going to hire? And this secretary is advising the Duke, saying, well, Josquin has applied for the job, but people say that he's difficult to work with, and he's asking for a lot more money. I think we should hire this other guy, Heinrich Itzhak, who is apparently much easier to work with and is not asking nearly as much money. The Duke chose Josquin and not the other guy, because Josquin was the big deal. For example, they have this mentioned in the book on page 83. Martin Luther himself. Martin Luther, remember, the instigator of the Protestant Reformation, who was himself a very well-trained musician, had the following to say about Josquin. He said, God has his gospel preached also through the medium of music. This may be seen by the compositions of Josquin, all of whose works are cheerful, gentle, mild, and lovely. They flow and move along, and are neither forced nor coerced, nor bound by rigid and stringent rules, but on the contrary, are like the song of the finch. All right, now that's an interesting quote. And first of all, for someone as famous as Martin Luther, and as knowledgeable about music, to mention Josquin specifically about how wonderful his music is, that tells you something about Josquin. But there's something even more interesting to me in here as a music professor. Martin Luther says, his point is that the works of Josquin they are gentle, mild, and lovely. They flow and move along and are neither forced nor coerced and bound by rigid and stringent rules, but on the contrary, are like the song of the finch, are like as natural as birds singing. You don't get the feeling of rules or being followed, and in fact, this kind of cuts at the heart of Renaissance compositional technique, because in fact there were rigid and stringent rules that you learned as a composer during the Renaissance, that you were trained in, that you had to memorize and drill, because the Renaissance style was very complex, and you learned it by a series of steps or rules. And anyone, like in my position, who's gone to grad school and in music and had to take a class in Renaissance counterpoint, there are in fact rules and levels, and it's very difficult, and it's also very subtle, these rules. The listener might not necessarily pick up on them if they don't know the rules. And in fact, the genius of composers like Josquin and Palestrina is that they can obey these rules and follow these rules without giving the impression that they are following and obeying rules. It sounds very natural and spontaneous. It doesn't sound like rules are being followed. It sounds, well, you'll hear how it sounds in a minute. Words can't do it justice. I think this is the most beautiful music ever written by anybody. Renaissance choral a cappella polyphony, I think, is, in terms of sheer beauty, is the most beautiful music ever written by anybody, in my opinion. Okay, so the piece that we're going to listen to is an example of a motet. And a motet is one of our two major genres of sacred music in the Renaissance. We have the motet and we have the mass. And we're going to listen to an example of a movement by a mass a little later on, but first we're going to listen to a motet. A motet is basically a relatively short, like between 3 and 5 minutes, a choral work based on some sacred text or devotional text, let's say. In this case, it's a Hail Mary. It's a prayer of praise to the Virgin Mary. But it could be anything. It could just be a passage from the Bible, or just some kind of devotional text. It's a sacred genre, which is then set to music in polyphonic texture, multiple lines of melody going on simultaneously, a cappella, without instrumental accompaniment. And the Mass, as we'll get to, of course, is a setting of the ordinary prayers of the Mass, those prayers which don't change from one liturgical day to the next. The 5 ordinary prayers of the Mass set to music, that's a Mass. A motet has a text or has words that are not part of the Mass, or not already part of the liturgy, just some other kind of sacred or devotional text that is set to music. So in this case, it's a prayer to the Virgin Mary. And what I want to talk about first, there's lots to talk about in this little 5-minute piece. But first I want to talk about the relationship of the words to the music, because this is a very big deal to Renaissance composers. They are always making a very strenuous effort to somehow reinforce the meaning of the words, or depict the meaning of the words through the sounds, through the music. And sometimes it's going to be done maybe in a very obvious way, like we'll listen to a Madrigal next lecture, where it's done in a very obvious way. But sometimes it's done in a very subtle way, and that's certainly true of Josquin. In fact, thinking of that word subtle, Renaissance music is the most subtle kind of music. It doesn't blow you away. It doesn't bowl you over. It's not overly emotional, I guess, in a sense, depending on how you respond to. I mean, I find it emotional, but it's very subtle and refined, and especially in the way that it deals with the relationship between the notes and the words. So in this case, we're not even really sure who wrote these words. And I'm here on page 84 and 85 in the Ninth Brief Edition, where they have a listening guide to Ave Maria Virgo Serena, this motet by Josquin. And the form of the text is, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sort of 4-line groups. If you call them stanzas or verses, okay? And they always begin with Ave, hail, Ave Maria, Hail Mary. And each one of these 6 verses, whatever you want to call it, kind of expounds on some magnificent attribute of Mary. And it's sort of a formal prayer. It says, Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee, serene virgin. Hail, whose conception, full of great jubilation, fills heaven and earth with new joy. Hail, whose birth brought us joy, as Lucifer, the morning star, went before the true sun. Wait a minute, what's Lucifer doing in here? What's a reference to Lucifer doing in a prayer of praise to the Virgin Mary? I'll get to that in a minute. It's not Lucifer the devil. It's something else. I'll come back to that. Next verse. Hail, pious humility, fruitful without a man, whose annunciation brought us salvation. Hail, true virginity, immaculate chastity, whose purification brought our cleansing. Hail, glorious one in all angelic virtues, whose assumption was our glorification. And then we have a sort of a pause in the music, and the last 2 lines, which are totally unlike the previous 4-line groups, doesn't start with the word hail. It doesn't expound on some magnificent attribute of Mary. It just says, O Mother of God, remember me, Amen. O Mater Dei, memento mei, Amen. It's a personal plea on the part of whoever, to Mary. And this is how Catholics kind of view Mary as our champion, our intercessor with God, as a mother figure. When you're in these times of dire need, you pray to this mother figure who will then go, tap God on the shoulder and say, you think we could, Anyway, so that's sort of the sentiment here. And the way that Josquin depicts this text is done in very subtle ways, and some of it's explained down this left-hand column in the listening guide. So I'm going to be sort of, riffing off of some of that. So first of all, the texture of this music, like Renaissance music generally, is polyphonic. We have multiple layers of melody going on simultaneously, and each of these layers of melody are sort of independent from the others, but they also have to mesh together. And they mesh together wonderfully to produce just exquisite combinations and chords and harmonies. But they also imitate each other. So as you will see, if you clicked on the link that I provided in the last D2L, where I've got a link to the YouTube recording of this piece, in that recording there's like a little visual aid where it points to the different imitative entrances of the melody in the very opening. And this is an example we call imitative counterpoint, where the different melodic lines imitate each other at various points, or sort of like conscious of each other. They are independent, but they are imitating each other in sort of a staggered way in time. Now, a couple places in here, we have this sort of examples of text painting. So for example, the second verse, where we have these words, Hail, whose conception full of great jubilation. fills heaven and earth with new joy. The music suddenly gets more animated, more excited. Over here in the next verse where it says, and this is where I need to explain about Lucifer. Hail, whose birth brought us joy, as Lucifer, the morning star, went before the true sun. Okay, Lucifer literally means light bearer. And this was, the name Lucifer was not attached to the devil until much later. Okay, that's not biblical. So the name Lucifer actually means light bearer, and it was a term that was sometimes used for the planet Venus, which is the brightest thing in the sky other than the sun and the moon. Okay, Venus being closer to the sun than we here on Earth, we can only see it, depending on the time of year, before the sun rises, at which point the sky gets too bright and you can't see what appears to be a very bright star. It's actually a planet. But it can only appear before the sun rises, in which case we call it the morning star, or sometimes after the sun sets. So if you've ever looked in the west at sunset and seen what seems to be like a super bright star, like maybe an airplane, it looks so bright, it might be the planet Venus, right? So the comparison that's being made in the text here is that Mary, the birth of Mary, came before the birth of the true Son, get it? Son of God, in the same way that Venus rises before the sun when it is the morning star. You know, it's like an omen, a portent. Okay. And the way this is illustrated in the music is by having imitation, by having a duet that spins out this melody and then is imitated by another duet. So, and it's a very subtle thing. It's the kind of thing that if you didn't study the music and study the text and listen to it a few times, you might not even be aware of it. Right? When we get to the very end, so remember those last two lines I talked about. O Mater Dei, memento mei, amen. O Mother of God, remember me, amen. What Josquin does is he has everybody sing in the same rhythm. Now they're still singing different pitches, so they're singing in harmony, but they sing in the same rhythm on these words to give an impression of one person, sort of like an individual, making a personal plea to the Virgin Mary. O Mother of God, remember me, amen. Sort of like, remember me at my moment of need. And in order to make it sound like a me, like an individual, Josquin has everybody sing in the same rhythm. Whereas before they were singing in different rhythms and obviously, you know, different identities to these different melodic lines. So it's a very subtle thing. Okay, so what we're going to do is I'm actually going to take us through kind of like how we got to this point. I'm going to review a little bit since we have our test coming up, and we're going to listen to a little example of, first of all, Gregorian Chant in the Middle Ages, and Notre organum, right? Organum being the earliest type of polyphonic music from, let's say, the 13th century, and then we'll listen to some Ars Nova music, that is from the very late Middle Ages, the 1300s, the 14th century, and then we'll listen to Josquin, and hopefully you hear the difference, the evolution. Okay, so first of all, Gregorian Chant. So this is the Alleluia Vidimus Stellum, one of your listening examples. And this, you know, could be from, I mean, who knows when? Let's say maybe the year 800 or so, maybe even earlier. And it sounds like this. It's monophonic in texture. Right? We have a single line of melody. All right. And now skip ahead a little bit. Let's say, I don't know, 400 years or so to Notre organum of the 12th, 13th century. Now, polyphonic. Notice how we have voice is on top, moving faster, and the voice on the bottom that's mostly holding the same tone. The voice that is holding, that's what we call the tenor, and that's actually the Gregorian chant. It's been stretched out. Okay. That's the Gregorian chant, all stretched out, and the voices that are moving above were added by the composer, in this case the composer Perotin, and they are moving faster than the Gregorian chant, and the rhythm, as you can hear, is kind of repetitive and simple. It's like long, short, short, long, short, short, long. That's the rhythmic modes, this fairly primitive system of rhythm where we basically have long notes and short notes, and we put together these prefabricated combinations of long and short and just kind of repeat them. Right? And the harmony, it's a lot of like open fifths there. Not a lot of triads, so it sounds kind of thin and hollow. Let's skip ahead now to the Ars Nova period. So this is Machaut. This is the Agnus Dei from his Mass of Notre Dame. And now, the four different voice parts, still a cappella, polyphonic, but the different voice parts have much more rhythmic independence, and the rhythm is much more complex, because this is when composers had the ability to write very specific rhythms and come up with any combination they can think of. They aren't limited to the sort of long and short prefab rhythmic patterns of Notre Dame organ, the rhythmic modes. In the 14th century, that's why they call it the Ars Nova. We have this new system of writing rhythm. So each of the different parts are more rhythmically complex. The harmony is sometimes a little weird, though. I mean, a lot of times it's nice, but there's some slightly off-putting dissonances, and to our perspective anyway, strange sounds in the harmony. Right, and this is composed again in the, let's say, the mid-1300s. Mid to late 1300s. Like here, some of these dissonances are a little weird to our modern ears. Okay, now let's skip ahead to the piece we were talking about today, Josquin. So now we're around, let's say, 1475 or so. And here's what Josquin sounds like. Hear how the voices imitate each other? And notice how the blending of the different voices is so smooth. And the sound is much richer because we're using more of the sort of pitch spectrum. We're going all the way down into the bass register, which Machaut didn't really do. Right? It's fuller because it's using up more of the available tonal spectrum. And notice we don't always have all four voices singing the way we did in the Machaut. Sometimes we just have two at a time, and sometimes we have all of them. And by the way, we're getting now to this place, Celestria terrestria, fills heaven and earth with new joy. So that the music is getting more animated. We're at the end of the second verse. And it gets a little more exciting in a subtle way, because that's what the text is about. And now comes the next verse, the reference to Lucifer. Hail, whose birth brought us joy, as Lucifer the morning star went before the true sun. And what we have is imitation. You can hear the lower voice imitating, coming behind the other one. Hear how the different voices enter and imitate each other. Next verse. And notice how the phrases kind of dovetail. As one phrase is ending, the next one begins, so that everything just kind of keeps flowing continuously. Let me turn it back up a little bit. Okay, now we're at this verse, fifth verse. We're going to triple meter. It's like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. And now is the last 4-line stanza. Hail, glorious one, in all angelic virtues. Of course, it's in Latin, translating into English. Notice how we have mostly consonants. Different tones blend together. There is occasional dissonance, but it's smoothed over, so it doesn't stick out. And now this sounds like an ending, but now the last 2 lines. Okay, so that is Ave Maria Virgo Serena by Josquin. And wait a minute, let's pause for a sec. The next, the only other sacred work that's presented as an example in here is by Palestrina. So Palestrina is the greatest composer of the late Renaissance. And although he did compose some secular music early in his career, the greater part of his career was spent as the court composer to the Pope himself, basically the composer in residence in the Vatican at St. Peter's in Rome. So he had the top musical job in the entire Catholic Church, and he was seen as like the top dog in the musical world in the 16th century. So they mentioned that during his time there, this is when the Catholic Church is going through the Counter Reformation, and I put a link up again in the D2L about the Counter Reformation, which was basically the Catholic Church's attempt to confront the challenges of the Reformation. So we have the Reformation, and you have the Counter Reformation. The Reformation, remember, is this sort of rebellion against the church, led by Martin Luther and later John Calvin, Henry VIII, and others, which led to the formation of breakaway, separate Christian churches which were not under the control of Rome. Well, the Catholic Church, in response to this great crisis, eventually kind of got itself together and said, well, we have a real crisis here that we have to address. We have to find ways to strengthen the church, against this this trend of these breakaway churches, because the church was losing, a lot of its flock. So the Catholic Church undertook something called the Counter Reformation, where it's sort of, basically there was a 20-year-long meeting, 18 years, whatever, called the Council of Trent, where the leadership of the church, the bishops and cardinals and the Pope, got together and decided, okay, well, what are we going to do? How are we going to fix the problems that led to the Reformation? How are we going to try and win some of these people back and strengthen the church in the face of this challenge from this rebellion, basically? And they talked about various things, over the 18 years of this Council of Trent. And various things happened, but among the things that were discussed by the Council of Trent was music. Now, music wasn't really on the front burner of the problems that the church was facing in the 16th century. So music was not like a really important item on the agenda, but nonetheless it was an item, and some of the more conservative clerics, bishops and cardinals said, well, while we're at it, while we're talking about ways of talking about how to reform and restructure the church, the music these days in church it's awfully theatrical and too complex, and the main problem is you can't tell the words. The sacred text of these words that we are supposed to be, remember this, the purpose of this music is praising God, and the words had become so obscured by these composers and their tricks and their gimmicks and their polyphonic texture, which makes it harder to understand the words, remember. Some of these more conservative clerics are saying, well, what we should do really is go back to strict Gregorian chant and get rid of all this fluff and all this basically composers showing off with all this polyphonic stuff. That did not end up happening. Really not much was done with music as a result of the Council of Trent. But it's thought that one of the reasons why not much was done, that is, no orders came down like you must compose music this way and not that way, is that Palestrina, who was the big, the top dog composer within the Catholic Church at the time, was so skillful in demonstrating that you could create polyphonic music in which the words were easy to understand and in which the texture and the music served the words and did basically what the church wanted, which was to keep the focus on worship and on and heightening the meaning of these words, and not like trying to dazzle the congregation with too much in the way of musical effects, because that would be kind of wrong. Remember why we are here. We're not here to blow people's minds with music. In sacred music, the main goal, of course, is to glorify God and not the composer, who's a mere man. Right? So there's sort of a tension there. And Palestrina addressed this so well and was so convincing in his style that apparently, so the legend goes, the Council of Trent, who actually heard a performance of the piece that we're about to listen to now. This is maybe Palestrina's most famous work, one of 104 different masses. Now, they're the same mass, the same text, but set to music 104 different times. Palestrina alone composed 104 masses, hundreds of other sacred works, as well as secular songs, like love songs from earlier in his career. But this is his most famous work, the Pope Marcellus Mass. So Pope Marcellus was a pope who didn't reign for very long, but who Palestrina had served and known personally. So he composed this Mass and named it after Pope Marcellus, and it's known as the Pope Marcellus Mass. Actually, if you go to the Vatican, if you go to St. Peter's, if you go just beneath the altar of St. Peter's, there's a stairway that leads down into the crypts, where the tombs of various popes, where Peter himself was. That church is built on that spot because that's where St. Peter was hung upside down in the center of Rome, back in the 1st century AD. So there are these crypts underground, and you can actually go and find the tomb of Pope Marcellus and Pope John Paul II and various other popes right underneath St. Peter's. Anyway, this Mass, the Pope Marcellus Mass, is like any Mass. It's basically just a setting of the 5 ordinary prayers of the Mass. The Kyrie, Gloria, Credo, Sanctus, and Agnus Dei. And what we're going to listen to is just the first movement, the Kyrie. And remember, the words of the Kyrie are very simple, very short. It's the shortest prayer, and it's the only one that's in Greek instead of Latin. It's Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison, Kyrie eleison. That's the whole prayer. So that's all the words that you're going to hear. So there's 3 sections to this first movement of this 5-movement Mass. The first movement is the Kyrie. And the way this melody goes, they have it written out here, and even if you can't read music, on page 87, you can see it repeats the same note a few times on the Kyrie, and then it skips up to le on the word Kyrie eleison, and there's a long scale that goes down from there. Kyrie eleison. And to me, and this is my impression, but now what do the words mean? Lord, have mercy. And to me, it's like the individual down here on earth praying up to God. Kyrie ele. And then from there, the mercy sort of coming down from God step by step. Kyrie eleison. Like it's sort of like the mercy kind of flowing down like manna from heaven, you know. Now this is just my maybe stupid imagining. This is what Palestrina sort of sets off in my head. I'm like, why did he shape this melody in the particular? Why does it make me think of this like a prayer up to heaven and then a response back down from heaven? This Mass is in 6-part polyphonic texture, so there are 6 separate independent voice parts going on at all times. And this recording that the book uses is I know this piece pretty well. I know the different recordings of it, and this one is the greatest. The blending is just incredible. This is the Tallis scholars singing the first movement, the Kyrie, from the Pope Marcellus Mass by the greatest late Renaissance composer, Palestrina. Let me go back a little bit so it starts. And listen to the voices imitating each other and how they coalesce on these different chords. It's very subtle. At any given moment, 1 or 2 voices emerge from the texture, like here. And they're all singing the same words, Kyrie eleison, but staggered in different rhythms. And now they're coming to the end. So that's the end of the first section, Kyrie eleison, and now we sing Christe eleison. makes you think of this must be what angels sound like as they're singing, right? Notice how they're not singing with any vibrato. It's absolutely pure, which means it has to be absolutely in tune to blend like this. It's incredible. Now we sing Kyrie eleison again. Again, the imitation. Gradually all the voices come in. And sort of surging ahead. We're coming to the end. Okay, and then there would be 4 other movements to this Mass after this one. Hold on just a second. That's a Madrigal. We'll listen to that one next week. Or next lecture, not next week. Although it might end up being next week since today is Saturday. Again, it's a pity we've only had one lecture on sacred music of the Renaissance, but I urge you to check this stuff out. Like if you go to Pandora, my favorite channel on Pandora is Choral Music Radio. So if you search for Choral Music Radio, if you like what you heard, you will hear much more like this by other composers, not just from the Renaissance, but from today as well. And it's all, for the most part, a cappella. That is, with voices only. Some of them on Choral Music Radio also have instruments playing along. But Renaissance polyphony, generally speaking, is a cappella, voices only. And if we're talking about sacred music, like those 2 pieces we just listened to, it's in Latin, especially if it's from the Catholic Church. Now, as we progress through the Reformation, of course, we have, let's say, the Lutherans with their services in German, and the English, Church of England, with their services mostly in English. So now that we're in the Renaissance, just because we are listening to a sacred work doesn't necessarily mean it'll be in Latin. If it's a Catholic sacred work, yes, it'll be in Latin. And both, obviously, Palestrina, who worked for the Catholic Church, and also Josquin, who was born before the Reformation. They were both Catholic, but we also have prominent Protestant composers as we move later in the Renaissance. So next time I'll talk about secular music in the Renaissance, and we'll focus on the Madrigal and the lute song, and also maybe a little bit about purely instrumental dance music. Okay? See you then.